It's my pleasure to once again introduce Pete Leach from Houston, Texas to our audience. Pete got his start in model railroading later than most. In his mid-20s, he picked up some used in-scale equipment from a local shop and started on what's now a 45-year journey. He's built several layouts over the last 30 years, but a move to Houston in 2012 gave him the opportunity to switch to ON30. Pete has been active in the Houston Sandjack Model Railroad Club and served on the board of directors of the Lone Star region of the NMRA. He's presented clinics on several modeling and prototype topics at local, regional, and national levels. He's authored over 85 articles that have been published in local club newsletters up to national hobby magazines. Pete earned his MMR number 649 in 2020 with the help of some great local modelers in the Houston area. And on a personal note, he's been married to his wife, Kathy, for 48 years, 2 grown sons, 3 grandchildren. In 2023, he retired from the Velcro companies after 41 years of service.
Thank you, Mark, for those kind words, and welcome everybody. So, as the title of my clinic is Downsizing My Layout, but it actually probably should be called, What Do You Do When You've Finished Your Dream Layout? So some of you may have known me for my ON30 layout based on the main 2-footer, the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway. Now, if you didn't get to see it, you can still find it online. I did a clinic about 3 years ago on this, showing the layout. And it's also in print. It was in the November, December 2020 Gazette. More recently in the 2025 Model Railroad Planning, Tony Custer reached out to me and asked me for an article. So a quick background. I was inspired to build this layout when I ran across this book called 2 Feet to Tidewater back in the 1980s. I was captivated by the dust cover here with a small locomotive pulling some wooden cars across a trestle in front of a waterfront facility. I'd never heard of the railroad, but I bought it anyway, bought the book, and it probably cost me 3 or 4 months of my hobby budget, but I took it home and read it thoroughly and set it as a goal someday to build a layout based on this railroad. Now, after decades of trying an HON30, that's the scale and gauge made famous by David Frary and Bob Hayden, I finally ran across a Bachmann ON30 Fournier at a train show back in 2011 and really started this journey. So the model was a Baldwin 28-ton 244 that I modified with a new Mount Blue Models pilot and cab to bring it closer to looking like the number 7 on the prototype. Now, construction on the layout actually had to wait about a year until we moved to Texas. Our grown sons had finished colleges up in New England, and they both moved to Houston area, so we moved down here, and then I got started on this dream layout. Building this thing was truly a labor of love. I enjoyed researching it and meeting a lot of people along the way. I also had to learn how to pour a lot of water. I had never had any water on any of my layouts in the past. I also had to build this 5-foot-long trestle with hand-laid track and 2 spurs on it. I never hand-laid track before either. I also built these, or rebuilt these structures along the front. This is my second version of it. This is the scene that kind of inspired it at all. These were built with drawings I got from the late Peter Barney. I also had to learn how scenery, so I learned how to do static grass. I'd never done that before. Painting backdrops, as Mark Lachey knows, I've kind of become my thing here. Also, I had to scratch build a bunch of eastern white pine trees. If you're going to model Maine, you got to have eastern white pine trees. There were no commercially available things, so I scratch built about 2 dozen of these for my layout. I also had to deal with this change from N scale to O, the distances. So I learned about this thing called forced perspective. So that little gray truck in the background is an HO scale Jordan model. And it's only about 7 or 8 inches from the O scale truck in front of it. But by 2022, I was done building the layout. All major construction had been done. I did a lot of upgrades, including that boxcar number 67 behind the locomotive. I rebuilt that. I rebuilt a lot of things that didn't hold up to my standards. I also made an upgrade by adding it turns out to be a plow track to one of the towns in the town of Albion. And since I added that plow track, I had to build a plow and a flanger to go along with it. And on a personal note, as Mark said, I retired in 2023. My wife is smarter than me. She retired a few years earlier, quit working. And then as 2024 was ending, we were both approaching the age of 70. We started asking ourselves, do we really want to stay in this home or maybe find something a bit smaller? We're empty nesters, and do we really need a 4-bedroom house with a den, a yard, and a pool? This house requires a lot of attention and upkeep. There's not a month that doesn't go by that I have to repair, replace, or fix something that I didn't want to. We also travel a lot in our spare time. We are family on the West Coast and the Midwest. We're also enjoying traveling around the world to see things that we haven't places we haven't been to before. But there's this bedroom full of model railroad layout I had to deal with. So I knew if I ever wanted to sell the house, I'd have to take the layout down. But this would be a difficult decision to even think about. This was my dream layout. And actually, I considered it my forever layout. But as 2024 rolled into 2025, I really began hard thinking about moving. Or maybe just tear down the layout and start over. That would be crazy. A lot of my buddies down here and around the country were saying, well, why don't you tear down this layout? We've got a lot of nice compliments from people who visited, either in person or virtually. So I asked myself, why would I make such a drastic move here? What were my options? So first, I could keep the layout and maintain it as long as possible. At some point, I know my physical abilities may not allow me to enjoy it or even maintain it. We're all getting older, and I know, our eyesight and our motor skills start to diminish. But then I could have friends and family take over until, well, what happens. Or I could take it down and become an armchair model railroader. I know a few down in clubs down here, and they seem quite happy. I could show folks articles and photos of my layout and talk about how it was, maybe take on a few project builds from others. But I knew neither of these options would keep me interested in this hobby. So what if I just replaced the current layout with a smaller one that would keep me in the hobby, but still be achievable in the time I have left? Now, there's nothing wrong with me, don't worry about that. But let's face it, we're all looking at most of us are looking at the back end of things. So I set a goal to start tearing down the layout February 1st of this year. So late in January, I thought maybe I'll shoot some video of the layout to share on YouTube. Well, I spent a couple of days dealing with derailments and poor electrical pickup and sound decoder problems. And then I found a broken switch I was going to need to solder to get the thing going again. So then I asked myself, why not just rip off the Band-Aid? So on January 28th of 2025, the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway ceased operations in Tomball, Texas. So I started pulling the rails on the end of track on the north end in Albion, worked my way around to the other end in Wiscasset. So here's the wharf. 3 days later, it was gone. So this was a tough decision, but it was done. There was no turning back. So with the old one gone, it was time to maybe apply some lessons I learned from this layout to something new. Let's talk about some of those lessons. First, don't build too big of a layout. Now, as I grow older and hopefully wiser, I want a realistic approach to what I can achieve in what I call my prime hobby time. This last layout was only 10 feet by 12 feet. But would a bedroom size layout be achievable in time I've got? This thing took me 10 years to build, but it also took several years of planning and thought process and research. But I did want to stick to ON30 since I have a couple of great running locomotives with sound. I also like the size. No offense, but ON30 is like the perfect for me. The equipment's large enough to be heavy, to move and track well. And yet the rolling stock's not much bigger than a modern HO rolling stock. So next, my traditional bench work has always been L girders, half-inch plywood, and homosoap. Even when I was doing N scale years ago, I still used this system. So that may not fit my needs going forward. I've always attached the L girder directly to the wall, which is fine in a basement or a studded wall. This was in a finished bedroom. I also try to overlap the joints of the lumber, plywood, and homosoap to give a firm seam so there's no lifting. Now, this all resulted in strong bench work, but it damaged the finish of the sheetrock walls, and it sure made tearing down very difficult. This 12-foot long section I had to take out in one piece. My wife and I struggled to get it out to the door to lay it down here under the garage so I could cut it up for the trash people to haul away. So I'm thinking building in manageable sections would help me locate it, move it if we decide to relocate at some point. So next, using full-scale mock-ups has really helped me in the design and building phases. Saved me a lot of wasted time in the past. So like when I was designing and laying out the town of Albion on my old layout, I built this full-scale mock-up of the two-story station. So as I moved track around and I finally spiked that down what I wanted, I could shift this around a little bit to get the best viewing, the best place for operations, and even photography. And this is how it wound up. I also sometimes actually build the complete structure ahead of time, and I design and build around that. That way I make sure I get what I want. So on my last layout, I wanted to add a wharf, so I wanted a schooner. I built the schooner first, and then designed the wharf around it. So I took a piece of foam core, I spray painted it brown because I had brown paint, set it up on blocks, added some foam core mock-ups of some of the structures on there, throw in some flex track and move some cars around. I did this over a period of weeks until I got the way I wanted it. And then I built the wharf. So next, building a prototype-based layout really kept me focused. It also kept me from buying stuff that I didn't need. I'd go to the hobby shop or train shows and say, well, would that fit on my layout? Probably not. I also tried to keep everything historically correct, everything within the era and the geography, etc. So I built these bunch of timelines. So this is the one for the locomotive roster. So on the left are the 9 engines that the railroad owned in this 40-ish years. Then the dark green lines are the years they were in service. The yellow lines are when it was owned by someone else, and then it got retired and scrapped later. So since I was going to be modeling 1925, I could simply strike a line through there, tell me the 5 locomotives they were, plus it gave me an idea of like a cab replaced and etc. I did something similar for the passenger cars, much of the rolling stock, and even some of the towns and buildings along the way. I also really enjoyed recreating some of the prototype scenes on the layout. Take an historic photo like this. So this is the main central crossing heading towards Portland, away from the viewer here, with the narrow gauge going left to right. And this is how it turned out on my layout. That wharf, this was a photo I had of a 3-masted schooner called the Horatio. It's being loaded with boxboard lumber on site. There's also a tramway for unloading coal, and there's a peaked roof in right to the left of the foremast, showing of a pier station there. And this is how it turned out on my layout. Now I did have to use a lot of modeler's license. We all have to make compromises when we're modeling. So I wanted to include the roundhouse, turntable, the rest of the facilities on the layout, but they would have been way off to the right out of the frame here in an area where this wasn't available. So I just put it right here in the corner. That's what we have to do. We do have to make some compromises, even when we're trying to model a prototype. But this whole prototype thing really limited my creativity. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, can I put this on the layout? Was that car, not only was the period correct, but would they have actually owned a 1913 Ford coupe driving around the dirt roads of Maine? I'm not sure. So I get hung up on that a lot too. So I also found that hand laying track to be not only cost effective, but I actually found it kind of satisfying. It's kind of something zen. I put on my earbuds and some music, and I start spiking the rail. I also hand built my own turnouts using Fast Tracks jig, so that worked out well too. Now I do hate electronics, so I didn't put any of my tortoise machines. I had a bag full of them. I sold them off. I don't like those kind of mechanical machines. I used a lot of caboose throws. While they're not very prototypical looking, they're very reliable. And I've had one or two fail over 10 years and it's simply to replace. Now, I did use some Blue Point throws for some hard to reach places in the yard. Now, Blue Points work like a tortoise if you're not familiar with them, but instead of a motor actuating the mechanism, it uses a choke cable through these fascia, knobs in the fascia that to actuate that. Still has the contact points for the frogs if you want to use that, but it didn't require any special electronics. Now, my favorite part of the hobby is building models and specifically scratch building. I've also often told people I'm a scratch build modeler with a layout. Well, I used to have a layout. I also enjoy learning what went on in the structures. It helps me not only detail the outside, but doing in O scale. I like to include interiors, so I like to understand what went inside. Also, I think it helps tell the story, understanding what they were doing in this building, in this industry. I also love learning to use new techniques, things and materials I've not done before. So one of the things I learned on my last one was I needed a lot of wood shingles. Now they're commercially available, printed or laser cut, but I needed a lot. So I decided to make my own out of 1/64 inch thick plywood. I'd slit it to a quarter of an inch, which is a one foot in O scale. I would bundle 4 of them together, hold it together with a little bit of blue painter's tape, sandwich it between 2 paint sticks I got from the Home Depot. And then I would simply cut halfway through randomly and wind up with these strips that I could glue onto the sides of the buildings. I learned to mark reference lines every 6 inches so I could keep them all straight. And you work your way up and you wind up with a not too bad representation of a wood shingle. So how can I apply some of those lessons learned? Well, I think a 10-foot long shelf layout would offer a lot of modeling opportunities for me, even on a larger scale like On30. I'm sitting here in an office that has a 10-foot long wall. I used to doodle when I was working because, let's face it, my job was boring most of the time. But this is one of my doodles. What if I could put this layout in my office here? So this was a switching layout. It had a good layout that had a good sized run around in the middle. It had 4 spurs with a lot of spots for cars. It had a small turntable and an engine house off to the left, but that could also be another industry, and a good amount of waterfront. Now, this gave me some inspiration. I never got to build this layout. My wife vetoed any expansion of the railroad empire in the house. So, but something like that would fit into another room if we decided to move. And one of my must-haves is to have at least a bedroom-sized space if I were to move to a new house or even an apartment. And because I wouldn't fill it up because I want to leave space for some of my other hobbies. And I don't just do model railroad. So we've been looking around the houses, and here's an apartment we looked at not too long ago. It has a spare bedroom with a 12-foot wall. So that's something I could, easily fill up part of that wall. And I would want to build it in sections of probably 5 feet, but no longer than 6 feet maximum. So I could get it in and out of doors, not too heavy, and I could take it with me. But I'm going to need to explore other ideas for the benchwork. So I've been playing around with like 1-inch foam and 1/4-inch plywood, maybe even some cork road bed. So I decided to test it. So I took some 1-inch foam that I had in my closet and a sheet of 1/4-inch Luan that was in my garage. The backside is where I paint all my stuff. Glued it on there, and then I marked the some positions for some number 5 turnouts that I salvaged from my old layout. And then I decided to spike these things down. So on the lower one, I first glued down some cork road bed. It was N scale cork bed I had left from years ago. And I added a caboose throw. And then on the other one, I just spiked it directly through the ties and they were glued onto the foam. And I put a blue point screwed under the plywood underneath. I cycled these things well over 100 times. The rails didn't move. The point rails did, but the other rails did. This case gives me some encouragement that I can come up with something. I've still got a lot of testing to do, but I am encouraged that I don't need to use 1/2-inch plywood and Homosoap. I also, in my last layout, I built these heavy bookshelves that I could slide under there and it hold all my magazines and books and modeling supplies. And I think it was heavy enough to support a model railroad. So here I've got them lined up in my old layout room that my wife repainted the walls. I put new flooring down, but this thing is 10 feet long, and I've even got room for a 4-foot wide workbench in the middle that I could build models. So next, I want a freelance layout, one that doesn't follow a particular prototype, but has a main theme, coastal theme, that allow me to be more creative and not be stuck to what exactly was that the prototype was doing. So I made a lot of sketches. This is my high school drafting set from 1972 with some, I do this and I color it with some colored pencils I got from Walmart. But this is my version 10. I'm calling it Hayden Harbor, named in honor of Bob Hayden, who has been a huge influence to me over the years. It's 10 feet wide by 2 feet deep. I built it with a section here in the middle that could take it apart to move it if we decide to relocate. I would have some type of visible, movable, or removable staging yard somewhere over here. There's a lot of designs out there I've thought about, so I would design that based on the actual space that I'm going to be in. There's going to be an active harbor with a lot of rail access. And I want to include a bunch of new industries to me. So one would be a shoe factory up here in the left corner. Maine produced a lot of shoes in the early 1900s. This one is in Belfast, Maine, along the harbor there in 1925. A fertilizer plant, or at least part of a fertilizer plant, off to the left there. This is also in Belfast, Maine. This is the Co-Mortimer Fertilizer Company. They received limestone and phosphate rock in these large barges, or actually, I think they're schooner barges because they got sailing masts on them. But then they would pulverize it and process it and bag it and ship it out by rail. The lime fertilizer would go out by rail. A schooner wharf. Now, while I had a wharf on my old layout that handled a lot of things, I wanted something a little simpler, like this lumber loading operation going on here. This is all box boards that they were rough sawn out of pine, and then they would be sent down the coast to factories who would build boxes, because this is the days before corrugated. Here's an older one in Rockland, Maine. A bunch of fishing shacks. Wouldn't this really look great on a layout? I mean, what looks more Maine than this? No rail access, but I think a cool scenic access and a lot of spot for details. A fish cannery over here. There were more than 80 fish canneries on the coast of Maine in the early 1900s. Now, most people would assume they're canning lobster, and there was a little of that, but mostly they processed herring. They would be canned as sardines. Sardines were quite popular in the early 1900s. So this particular one's called the Seacoast Canning Company up in Lubec, Maine. I think I pronounced that right. A couple of people corrected me the other day. So I made a sketch of what it may look like on the layout if I shrunk it down to fit that area that I have on my layout. I can't fit the whole thing. I also started looking at how do they process the the fish so they could put it into cans and everything. So fish would be caught in these traps called wares, and then fishermen would go in there with these shallow boats and use dip nets to harvest them out of there. And then the fish would be transported or transferred into larger boats called sardine carriers, so they could be transported off to the canneries. There they were offloaded, and then they were gutted, and the heads and tails were cut off. Here we have a bunch of men and small boys out on tables outside doing this. I purchased a few 3D some figures. The one in Aspen's in the middle there, and I think the ones on the other two are from a company called 3DP or something. But anyway, I decided to mock this up. I gave my guys aprons. The guys on the left don't have them, but if I would be gutting fish all day, I want an apron. I'm not going to go home with that stuff all over me. So after that, they would be cooked or pickled and then off to the canning room where women would line them up into cans. Originally, the cans would have been made on site, but by 1910, the cans were made in factories that produced them and shipped them in, which is another source of rail traffic for me. Then it was off to the sealing. Sealing was done by soldering. This was a man's job. No boys, no women. It was the highest paid job in the plant, but it also came with the shortest lifespan. This was not a healthy occupation. They also employed a lot of local boys and girls, especially to pack the cartons, sweep, whatever they could do. Then the finished product was sent out by boat, or in my case, rail. Actually, after all, it's a model railroad. So, and then finally out to the right, a boatyard. So this boatyard would be a small shop that would receive lumber by rail and then either build new boats or repair older boats. So this, along with the fish cannery, is going to be part of a signature scene on my new layout. I always like to have one or two of these that kind of sets the tone for people to kind of gravitate towards. So I think this layout can keep me, busy for several years and should be a lot of fun. So what's going on, you ask? Well, still thinking about the house. Do we sell? Do we stay? But in the meantime, I decided to get an idea what this would look like if I built it. So I made this isometric sketch using my mad 10th grade drafting skills here. Anyway, and then I decided why not make one of these models of my layout. So I've always wanted to do that. I've seen other people do it. So I spent a couple of days doing this. It was a lot of fun. And I'm thinking as I build the layout, I can show people what it may look like if I ever get it done. So I also continue to gather information on fish canneries and other industries and details that'll help me design the final layout. But because I need to build something, I thought, why not get started on this boatyard? So why a boatyard? Well, as Mark said, I've been building, I became a model railroader later. I started building boats when I was 10 or 11. I was scratch building boats in high school. And I built everything from bank stories. This is a Texas sailing scow that was used to move goods along the Gulf Coast in Texas here. These are all work boats. I had some wood I purchased from a friend's estate, and I scratch built this Weskungas Bay lobster smack, or it's also called a friendship sloop. These were used to either go lobstering or for fishing. They had a live well, and that's why they call them a smack, because it would make the fish or lobster would smack the wells. I ran across this boat called a Rangeley boat. Vacationers in Maine would go up to get out of the city, and one destination was a place called Marbles, Maine, on the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. It's another 2-foot railroad. So there you would hire a guy to row you out under the lakes to go fishing for trout. Well, my buddy Al Torella out of Atlanta area, he's building that in Owen too. So I thought, why not making 11 of these things? So put on his Marbles town dock for the layout. Well, to make it an even dozen, why not making one more? So I sent him this one with a smirk. He asked for a discount on this, but it needs some work. But I also sent along the worker to help finish repairing this particular one. So like I said, I built a lot of boats, but never a boat shop. So thought this would be a great place to try some new techniques. I really wanted to see how much I could scratch build. It also helped me learn more about how full-size boats were built. So I start almost all my projects by first pre-staining wood. I hate trying to clean up glue spots after the fact. So in this case, I've got the flooring framing up here, but I thought since I want to detail the inside as much as possible, so I thought I better do all that before I close up the walls and make it hard to get at. So boat shops have a lot of benches for workbenches. This particular one's in the Lowell Boat Shop in Lowell, Massachusetts. This thing's more than 100 years old. They also need a lot of hand tools and a lot of clamps. I love these wooden clamps. In this case, they're holding on the rub rail on a bank story that they're building at the shop there. They're probably going to need a bandsaw to saw the frames. Some frames are bent, but some are sawn. And a drill press would be quite handy to make some precise holes. These are all from the little boat shop as well. So I started by scratch building this workbench and all these tools that you would need. So you see I've got a hand drill. I've got a bunch of those cool clamps I made. Once I figured out how to do it, it took me about 2 minutes to make one. So I scratch built a bunch of those. I got some block planes, some chisels. Everything here is scratch built except for the broom on the left is from Berkshire Valley, and then the crate on the right is from Train Troll. Then I built a second bench more for the planning purpose. So I've got some scrolled up plans here. I've got a bunch of details from my parts bin. I also put these half-hull models on the back. Today we buy these, very expensive, hang in our rooms or our dens to give that nautical look. But back then, these were used to not only document the shape of the hull, but also help plan the shape of the frames and the planking. So these are actually quite a tool they used in the boat shop. And to give them some power, I scratch built this bandsaw and drill press. Now you may recognize the Grant Line mining sheaves there for the pulleys. The motors are from some leftover parts from an On30 locomotive build. Everything else was cut from styrene and wire and brass tubing. So now this particular shop is going to specialize in a boat called a wherry. Now these wherries were used by local fishermen and lighthouse keepers. They were rather easy to row. They were very seaworthy and rugged enough you could drag them up even on the rocky shore of Maine. Now this one looks like it just came out of the showroom, but I used the same technique that I did on one of the others and used some pre-stained, pre-distressed wood to make one I call the wherry. Now sometimes boats were built upside down on a fixture called a strongback. So this is a Swampscott dory. Now that's the keel or the bottom at the top there. And the triangular thing off to the right is the transom or the stern of the boat. And you can see that the frames hanging from the keel there. Then you got these A-frame supports that are the strongback. So these would hold everything in place as they were planking the boat to keep everything fair and strong. So I scratch built one for my boat shop that I needed to build a partially built wherry. Now, one of my tricks is anytime I'm going to build these little boats, I make a fixture out of styrene. And then when I glue the wood together with sparingly a yellow glue, the yellow glue doesn't stick to the styrene, I can pop it off. That's how I made 11 Rangeley boats for Al Torella with one fixture. So anyway, here's a partially built one, a couple of aspen figures they're doing work on it. One's nailing a plank while the other one here is bending the plank. See a lot of those clamps around. So I took the benches, the tools, the boat, I installed it inside the structure. I added a Berkshire Valley potbelly stove because I had it. I put a scratch built coffee pot on the top just to say I did something to it. I added a bunch of wood shavings because when they're planking the boat, they're going to use a plane to plane off to get a really tight, watertight fit. And then over here on the bandsaw, I added some very fine sawdust around to make it look like this thing's been used recently. another view, you can see I did go back and darken the floor. Otherwise, everything would be that light wood color, and you wouldn't be able to tell what's what. So I mentioned I wanted to try some new things. So in the past, I used a lot of clavards. A lot of buildings have clavards on them. So I've always used like Mount Albert clavards siding sheets, like on this engine house. Yeah, I would go through with a little razor blade and make little slits for seams and peel some of them up on some of the worn structures. But I wanted to try a new method here. So decided to do them board by board clavards, but using HO 1x12s, which in O scale works out to about 1/2 inch by 6. So I worked my way up. I modify these clothespins by flipping them around to where the grabbing in is now the pinching in, you can reach in. I also get these spring metal paper clips from the office store. You take steal one of the handles from one of them, you insert it in there, and now you can clamp on something and have a reach to push down to hold these planks in place as you're waiting for the glue to set. I also decided to cut my own shingles this time and not long strips. So once again, I relied on some HO 1x and my old trusty chopper tool I've had. This is, I think, the third pad I've got in there. I rotate them, and just in case I flipped it over, I use it a lot. Then here's the first 1,000 shingles I cut. So I put some wood on the side, and then I marked it every 6 inches and just started yellow glue, tweezers, working my way up. This didn't take very long. And then when I was done, I trimmed it all up. Then I scratch built the transom window above the big door, and also the windows along the upper story there. Once again, I used some scale, in this case 1/2 inch by 1 inch scale strip wood on clear plastic with canopy glue. And then I continued the clavards up the side. Now I was going to need to put a peak roof at the top. So in order to do that, I just bought this Ultimation sander with a repeater in Pittsburgh. And I'm not into buying tools, guys, but I finally convinced myself, and that this allowed me to make 15 identical rafters to go across this thing. I could never have done it as well or as easily without that. I also used it obviously for the lower rafters as well. Now, I also scratch built all the doors out of wood. They're either swing doors or sliding doors, but none of them are operational. I didn't go that crazy. So I covered the roof with some 1x12s. Well, I was trying to decide what to cover them with. Well, I thought I finally stuck myself having to do shingles. But first I installed a smokestack above the stove that's inside. And then I scratch built this cupola on the top. I was so proud of myself. I sent photos out to a few of my modeling buddies, and Steve Bradley out in California, he said, I think that's a little too tall. So you may want to shorten that. So thanks, Steve. I had to, take it apart and rebuild it in a shorter, and I'll do that later. So to install the shingles on the roof, I made those reference lines every 6 inches. Then I used a steel rule with some of those clothespin clamps. As you can see, I could push it up against there, and it kept them fairly straight. Once again, all just pre-stained wood. Nothing's painted here. So if this looks tedious, I'm not going to lie to you, it was. So when I was done with the upper story, it was over 1,200 shingles installed. So then and then I was kind of trapped. I had to do the lower ones. So this required more. At the end, 3,000 shingles were cut, installed on the roofs and as well as the end. So, but I'm not sure I could have ever gotten this look with anything else. You can see I even got some new shingles in there where some repairs would have been done. I noticed after I took the photo, I keep knocking this door off its track, so I'll fix that later. So don't, if anybody notices that. So boat builders also use steam boxes to help heat and moisten the wood so they could bend it to make frames or planks. So I built mine from some scale lumber, pre-stained it. The stove and boiler there are some scrap tubing, brass tubing, and some styrofoam tubing. I think part of it came from one of those Grant Line chimney kits that they had, and then a bunch of styrene strips. I spray painted it with Rust-Oleum camo dark brown I use that for all my rusty metal, and then you can texture it and all that later, but that's my go-to for everything. Now, I put that steam box on a temporarily placed deck here while I'm trying to figure out what to do with this thing and how it should look. They wouldn't have put this inside because it would have created a lot more heat and moisture, and it was also a fire hazard. So you may have noticed I did shorten the cupola, and also at Steve's suggestion, I added a lightning rod because I don't want this thing to burn down. Now the guys are going to need a place to go, so I scratch built this little facility here, and because I can't help myself, I made this one with operating doors. Now, in case you're wondering, there are newspapers stacked up on the side for the paperwork that's needed afterwards. So the finished boat, put on a piece of scrap plywood and foam. I painted black just to temporarily hold it. I added all these pilings, and then I went and kind of carried away with the barnacles and the rockweed. It shouldn't be that high. I need to lower that when I install the layout, because at this point, if a high spring tide, flood tide would probably flood the inside if the barnacles are that high. Added a bunch of details, including some mini Prince gulls that I got. I bought a couple dozen of these not too long ago, and they're fantastic. Then on the side, I've got a ramp that with a rail that they would raise and lower boats as they were taking them in or going to launch them. There's that wary, and I got a couple of guys looking at it like, you really want us to fix this? On the back side or the track side, I've got racks where they would store lumber. So flat cars would be brought in and stack it there. There'll also be some stacks of lumber on the ground. And those two, I also included a grounding wire at Steve's suggestion, so the place doesn't burn down. But those two big wires on the back, so I can light it up for night viewing. And also, when I do all this work on the inside, I don't want to hide it. I want people to be able to see it no matter what the lighting system is. So here it sits, waiting for a layout to be built around it. You can see I've installed all my modeling supplies and stuff like that. I got a little workbench TV so I can watch Westerns while I'm doing this. Now, a quick postscript to the old layout. So what happened to all those structures on my old layout? Well, some of them didn't make it past the demolition phase. Some of them were either built in, or they were flats, or they really weren't fully appropriate. Some I'll keep as a memento, but there's an engine house in Albion, the coal shed and water tank from Albion, as well as this two-story station. I put these on platforms, and my wife and I flew up last week to Albion, Maine, and we've donated these to the Maine Historical Society. And here you can see me handing it off to a local caretaker, Phil Dow. This guy does not have internet or a cell phone, so it's quite hard to reach him. And there's me hamming it up on the right, holding the building that I built in front of the building that we patterned out there. Then the pier station and the station in Wiscasset, these have been, I brought those up too, and cases are being made for them, and they're going to be on display at the gift shop at the WWF Railway Museum in Alma, Maine later this summer. So I still have a lot of lessons learned to apply to this new layout that I'm working on. I think this is going to keep me active in the hobby for a long time. Wish me luck, and thanks for listening.
Wow. So the question that I have, Pete, is have you made a decision to stay in Houston or to move?
Yeah.
All right, so you're going to stay there.
Yeah. I've got grandkids here. I also have granddaughter out in Colorado, out in San Diego. So we go back and forth a lot, but I can't afford to live out there. So it's just, this house is big. We don't use much of it. I was in my pool last year once. It was too hot to go swimming when the water was like 95 degrees. So yeah, we're still thinking about leaving, but we'll see.
No, understood. So
we're going to take the summer off anyway, and we got a lot of traveling ahead, so we're not going to make any decision until September when we get back.
Very good. So just a couple of comments. Alan Anderson, of course, he said, I love some of the figures on your layout. Then he says, great job on the PL building. Then he says, what's the warranty on your shingles?
Hey, you don't get any stinking warranties with that.
And then Mark Lewis said, Pete, great presentation. Love On30. Let's see if there's anybody else. I think that's pretty much it. One thing being the insurance guy, I would say that please provide some safety for the young women, young girls working in the cannery. Those were notorious shops for the young kids. 100 years ago, they didn't have anything like child labor laws, so just make sure to take care of those
Well,
kids.
I know that my great grandmother and her whole family came over from Ireland in around 1880 to Fall River, Mass.
Yep.
And everybody but the 10-year-old, all like 6 kids, the mother and father, everybody but the youngest, who was 10, worked in the textile mill in Fall River, Mass. So, oh yeah.
Oh
So
yeah. There you
they
go.
were all weavers doing something. So yeah.
Don't you know?
And my
Very
problem
good.
is trying to find scale people of kids. Somebody said take an S scale figure and could that be a kid? I don't know. I haven't tried that yet, but that's my biggest challenge. There are a lot of children working in these places
Oh
that
yeah.
it's hard to find scale figures
Yeah.
of kids. And we start asking about it. It sounds kind of creepy, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
So,
So Alan, if you're still listening, there's a business opportunity to have small children to work in Pete's canning factory.
and
So
I've
there you
talked to
go.
Alan at the shows many times, and him and his and Lyle, and I tell them I cut their figures up. I have a little box I call body parts. What I love about a lot of their parts, you can mix and match, swap hands, heads, arms, legs, whatever. I cut one guy the back of his legs, a big wedge out. So instead of standing and hammering, he's now kneeling and hammering. So I'm pretty cruel to their figures.
There you go. All right, Pete, thank you very much.
Thank you everybody for listening.
Very good.